our companies collectively, they're going to spend right to the tune of about $700 million to make sure that broadband is available and working for the citizens within their service areas for the citizens of South Dakota.
Welcome to episode 369 of the Community Broadband Bits podcast from the Institute for Local Self-Reliance. I'm Lisa Gonzalez. If you live in South Dakota, you're no stranger to large swaths of rural landscapes. If you live in one of these rural landscapes, chances are good you're also no stranger to high-speed internet access. Even though much of the state is covered with ranch and farmland, cooperatives, tribal community and small ISPs, and a few municipalities are investing in high-quality connectivity for folks in South Dakota. Many of these providers are members of the South Dakota Telecommunications Association. This week, their Director of Industry Relations, Greg Dean, talked with Christopher about connectivity in such a rural state. Greg describes what the SDTA does for members and how their connections to local communities have influenced decisions and their ability to understand local needs. He discusses how working together has helped expand high-quality internet access, funding, and how broadband is more important than ever in rural communities. Now here's Christopher and Greg Dean from the South Dakota Telecommunications Association.
Welcome to another episode of the Community Broadband Bits podcast. This is Chris Mitchell with the Institute for Local Self-Reliance in Minneapolis, and I'm just starting the show for a second time after Greg and I are having this great conversation. So hopefully this won't seem a little bit stale to y'all, but I'll introduce Greg Dean, who is the Director of Industry Relations for the South Dakota Telecommunications Association, and is going to share a lot of the really remarkable investments we've seen in South Dakota. So, Greg, I was hoping you could tell the audience, in addition to me, now that I'm recording properly, what the SDTA does.
What we do here at the South Dakota Telecommunications Association is we represent the 18 companies within our membership, both on a regulatory and legislative basis in terms of doing advocacy work collectively for them. And as I described to people, these companies, these 18 companies, really have long histories and long roots back into South Dakota. The way I describe them is they grew up as telephone companies, but I think virtually every one of them today will tell you that they are a broadband provider first and foremost, and that and while they are all also video providers in some way, shape, or form, they will probably tell you that landline telephone is becoming an increasingly smaller part of their business as the years go by.
Now, when I see Telecommunications Association, I often think small, independent, private companies, often cooperatives in the Midwest here, but you have a different mix than most, I would say. So you tell us about your different kinds of members.
Like I said, we've got 18 member companies within our membership. The bulk of them, 12 of our 18, are member-owned cooperatives. We have 3 municipal companies. The only 3 municipal companies in South Dakota are members of our association. We have 2 small commercial providers, and then the Tribal Telephone Authority up at Eagle Butte.
And I always like to note this because we cover a lot of municipal type providers. Yours are the original telephone companies in the area. They're not municipalities that decided to get in later in the game.
Correct. These are all municipal companies that have been serving their respective communities for a number of years. The 3 in South Dakota are Brookings, which is home to South Dakota State University, a community of about 20,000 over on right on the Minnesota border, virtually. Beersford, which is a community of about, I would say, 2,000 to 2,500 people, about 30 miles straight south of Sioux Falls. And then the third is Faith, which is a small ranch community of about 500-600 people, probably about roughly 100 miles northeast of Rapid City.
And your members aren't from the metropolitan areas of South Dakota. I mean, a lot of listeners aren't going to be familiar with the population distribution, but when we're going to be talking about the remarkable investments that your members have made, it's important to note that this is the least dense areas of the state, and not in the most dense areas of the state.
These companies collectively serve about 76% of South Dakota's landmass. It's right at about 60,000 square miles. And actually, we just did a rough estimate in terms of the amount of population that these companies serve, and that estimate came up at about 280,000 people total that live within those 18 company service areas. So if you get right down to it, that pencils out to about 4.5 people per square mile. The biggest community that our companies serve is Brookings Municipal, served by Brookings Municipal Utilities. They actually their communications company actually goes under the name Swiftel, and then probably the second biggest community that our companies serve is Brandon, which is a bedroom community to Sioux Falls. It's about 5 miles east of Sioux Falls. And then it really tails off after that. Then you're really getting into communities of about 2,000 to 3,000 people would be kind of the next tier. And then it really gets down into a whole bunch of communities that have populations of 1,000 or less, and a whole lot of farm and ranch land in between those communities.
And that is not significantly different from what I think North Dakota has in terms of population. They've also had remarkable investment. But if you look south of yourself, where I think, again, you have similar density patterns, we don't see near the amount of investment in a state like Nebraska. So I'm curious if you can walk us through what has allowed your members to just make these kinds of investments, what motivates them in many ways.
Well, I think there's a couple of things. One is, and I give a lot of credit to the commitment and the foresight that these companies really have in terms of making sure that their customers really have the best and most state-of-the-art kinds of services available. And most of those companies within our membership are member-owned cooperatives, and so they are run by, and the policies are really driven by board members who live throughout the service areas. All of our member companies are community-based providers. I mean, they're all, I think all but one of them are headquartered in South Dakota. They really have a connection, both figuratively and literally, to the communities and the customers they serve. And so they really are committed and deeply woven into the threads of South Dakota's, into the threads of South Dakota's fabric. The other thing beyond just that commitment and that investment, and has really allowed South Dakota to take advantage of the broadband connectivity that's available today, is roughly 30 years ago, a subset of our companies originally saw an opportunity to begin interconnecting their own unique networks. And what really rose out of that is an entity called South Dakota Network, or what's known today as SDN Communications. And the original thought behind the creation of SDN was really to bring, back in the late 1980s, early 1990s, was really a way to bring about and give customers in South Dakota a choice of national long-distance services, because national long-distance companies at the time were probably not going to bring their own facilities and try to deliver their own facilities into places like Kimball and Groton and Bison and other kinds of small communities where our companies are headquartered. But our companies saw an opportunity that if they jointly engineer their networks and bring basically and aggregate their customers, bring them all together to one point, in this case, Sioux Falls, it made it much more attractive for the national long distance companies to come into one point in South Dakota. And so as a result of that, we have a significant amount of backbone fiber, transport fiber throughout the entire state of South Dakota that really has morphed into a really dynamic data delivery network. And as I call it, is the interstate highway system of data delivery, and really runs that kind of data connections out to and near to lots of small communities in South Dakota that probably would not have had that opportunity had it not been for the birth and creation and evolution of SDN Communications.
Well, I see that. I think it was the report that you did last year notes that even as of then, 76% of their customers already had broadband at the minimum FCC-defined 25 megabits down and 3 megabits up. And I'm guessing it's even increased more, but that's a sign of how deep they're going into the neighborhoods, because I'm presuming a lot of them have been using DSL, that they're switching over to fiber. That means that there's been a lot of investment to be able to drive DSL that fast.
Yeah, and the investment is, again, it goes back to the commitment and the foresight that these companies have. And as you well understand, and I think people who listen to this podcast understand, that delivering broadband out to the customers is no cheap service. And our companies are considered small when it comes to national comparisons. But collectively, from the beginning of 2013 through the end of 2017, in that 5-year window, our companies collectively invested right at about $400 million into their capital networks. And as we asked them what they projected to do in the 4 years following that, from the beginning of 2018 through the end of 2021, they're projecting they're going to spend an additional $300 million collectively. So over that 9-year period, our companies, again, albeit the fact that they are relatively small by nature compared to a lot of other companies, collectively they're going to spend right to the tune of about $700 million to make sure that broadband is available and working for the citizens within their service areas, for the citizens of South Dakota.
So with all that investment, I would guess that a fair amount of that comes from Washington, D.C. through the Universal Service Program historically. But I have no sense of how much. Like, what's attributable to that versus loans they're taking out? Like, how does this actually get financed in practice?
There's no doubt, but what the Universal Service Fund is a key component of the investment that our companies have made. We did a comparison of the costs of putting a mile of fiber backbone in rural South Dakota versus a metro area like Sioux Falls. And,
sure.
And in rural South Dakota, putting a mile of backbone fiber costs about $16,000. Because of all of the extra construction and challenges of putting a mile of fiber in Metro Sioux Falls, that number actually runs about $60,000 per mile. But again, if you look at the number of people in our service areas, it's a little over 4 people per square mile, versus in Sioux Falls, that number is almost 2,500 people per square mile. So the return per resident in Sioux Falls for a mile of fiber is about, the average cost to put that in is about a little over $25 per resident. You get into rural South Dakota, and that number skyrockets to over $3,500 per resident. And so that's why the economics of delivering comparable services in rural America versus urban America really are bridged by the Universal Service Fund. And that's why it's such a key component of making broadband both available and affordable in places like rural South Dakota.
When you say 16,000 per mile, I think some of the folks on my podcast would be curious how is that basically just a machine that's plowing it directly in with some sort of armored cable, or is it just, what sort of technology is that often using in the more rural parts of the state?
You're going to need to acquire the fiber strands. Those are obviously engineered in such a way that it is a very technical piece of equipment, and I equate broadband to basically like delivering water, for example. I mean, instead of putting a pipe in the ground that's going to have water running through it, you're going to put a piece of fiber in the ground, and there's going to be data running through it. In the case of a water system, you can push water through that pipe, but unless you've got a pump every so often on that water system, that water is only going to go so far. And it's the same way with electronics out in the field, out in rural parts of the country. And so not only do you have to put that fiber in the ground to connect homes and businesses across rural South Dakota, you also have to put electronics to make sure that signal gets a boost every so often. Otherwise, those speeds, the further out that you get, will tend to degrade, and they're just certainly not as usable or as viable unless you continue to put those electronics further out into the country. And so there's a cost obviously associated with those as well.
Right. Yeah. It's yet another additional cost that you don't have in the city in the same way. And I wanted to note, I think Minneapolis and St. Paul, if you get toward our urban areas, you're looking at $100,000 per mile, I think. Or, in some cases, even still larger and more dense cities, maybe per block, quite a bit. So one of the questions I wanted to ask you was, since you're the director of industry relations, I'm curious, what are the challenges that your companies are wrestling with right now to be able to finish off these investments and keep providing that high quality service?
I think one of the challenges they're wrestling with is just continuing to push that investment further and further out into the countryside. I mean, we talked earlier about the fact that I think it's extraordinarily commendable that these companies will be at 90% plus connections of fiber to homes and businesses across their service areas within just a couple of years. But that still leaves another 7 to 10% or so that still need to be connected, and those are some of the most sparsely populated parts of the country. So that will create a challenge. And I think the other thing that we as advocates for rural broadband providers have to continue to remind policymakers and elected officials that just because the fiber is in the ground and the electronics are out in the field, just because it's done once, doesn't mean that you're done. Doesn't mean you can stop, because about the time that you've gotten to maybe to that 100% connection rate, that's about the time that you got to start over, because some of those early pieces of fiber that were put in 20 or so years ago, maybe even earlier, now comes the time that you got to start replacing some of that. And the demand from the customer is such that they're demanding more and more all the time. I saw a presentation not too long ago where one of our industry consultants pulled a slide from a presentation he used back in 2004, I believe, where he put in this presentation the projections that by 2018, people were going to be demanding 50 to 100 meg at their homes. He said people thought I was crazy. They thought I was out of my mind, that nobody would ever need 50 to 100 meg. Well, we know now that 50 to 100 meg is kind of becoming the standard for even a lot of people in the consumer side of the business. And so it won't be, I don't think it will be too many years before we're realistically talking about 500 meg or a gig at the consumer level, let alone at the business level. And those are the kinds of things and demands that are going to continue to drive more and more investment from companies to make sure that their customers are suited and able to handle and deliver the kinds of services that those consumers are demanding in today's world.
Well, I think this gets to a point that can be a little bit contentious among some, which is this question of at which point does it make sense for the public to invest in rural areas? And so I'm curious, whenever you're hearing people, whether it's policymakers or if you just make the mistake of reading comments on a newspaper article or something like that, who are saying, well, if you choose to live out in South Dakota away from the metro, then maybe you shouldn't have high-speed internet access. Why is it smart that we have a Universal Service Fund and the Connect America Fund and things like that?
I would say that in a lot of cases, it's probably more important to bring broadband kinds of services and high levels of connectivity out to rural areas, simply from the standpoint of broadband and the internet make the world smaller. And in a state like South Dakota, and I'll give you a prime example, whether it be for delivery of educational services to small school districts, especially in very sparsely populated areas of South Dakota, or telemedicine kinds of facilities. I was just down in Sioux Falls and toured the Avera Health System is really known as a national leader in terms of delivering telehealth services to their clinics and hospitals across South Dakota. And they are able to connect emergency rooms in critical care facilities all across their footprint. They have a critical care and an ER-trained doctor, for example, in Sioux Falls, who can, in essence, look over the shoulder of a healthcare provider who is in an ER room in someplace like Chamberlain or Wessington Springs or a number of small town hospitals that can really advise that healthcare provider in that small town in a critical care situation, in a trauma kind of situation. So you've got another set of eyes and ears there saying, here's what you need to look for. And if you've ever traveled across South Dakota, once you cross the Missouri River at Chamberlain on I-90, it's about roughly about 200 miles to Rapid City. And in that 200 miles, and we can go 80 miles an hour on the interstate in South Dakota, so in that 2.5-hour drive roughly, there literally is one hospital that's about 10 miles off of the interstate. But there literally are no hospitals on that interstate highway system for about a 200-mile stretch. And access to even whether it be an ambulance or an emergency room, those are the kinds of things that make critical care and broadband and the internet really make the world smaller and provide those kinds of services that allow these people who live out here access to those kinds of services.
And I imagine that you have some stories we don't have enough time to get into, but there's probably a lot of people in South Dakota who are contributing mightily to the country and better able to because of high-quality internet access, whether it's through markets or interesting ideas or whatever else they might be doing.
Yeah, there's all kinds of examples of lone eagles who are working from their homes for major corporations, tourism kinds of businesses, precision agriculture, farmers accessing markets, just all kinds of stories where there are all kinds of commerce and job opportunities for people who live in rural South Dakota that are able to live and work in small communities simply because they have access to high-grade internet services.
Well, I'd like to wrap up by just noting three of my favorite things about South Dakota for many of the people who are listening who may not have had the benefit yet. And that's, of course, Badlands is amazing. Wild horses running around, and when you ever get a chance to come across those. And a town named after me, Mitchell, that has a corn palace. So I love driving across South Dakota because I see my name on every other sign on the eastern part.
Absolutely. Mitchell's a wonderful community, and I'm sure you have a good namesake right there. The Badlands are just phenomenal. If any of the listeners get a chance to stop through and take a tour off of Interstate 90 for a couple of hours, there's some great hiking opportunities. The only thing I would suggest is maybe going in the spring or the fall, because if you're out in the Badlands in a 95 to 100 degree day, it may not seem quite as appealing.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you so much for taking the time and working with me through the technical difficulties. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. Good to talk to you.
That was Christopher and Greg Dean from the South Dakota Telecommunications Association. Learn about the organization at sdtaonline.com. We have transcripts for this and other podcasts available at muninetworks.org/broadbandbits. Email us at podcast@muninetworks.org with your ideas for the show. Follow Chris on Twitter. His handle is @CommunityNets. Follow MuniNetworks.org stories on Twitter. The handle is @MuniNetworks. Subscribe to this podcast and the other podcasts from ILSR, Building Local Power, and the Local Energy Rules podcast. You can access them wherever you get your podcasts. You can catch the latest important research from all of our initiatives if you subscribe to our monthly newsletter at ilsr.org. While you're there, please take a moment to donate. Your support in any amount helps keep us going. Thank you to Arnie Huseby for the song Warm Duck Shuffle, licensed through Creative Commons. And thank you for listening to episode 369 of the Community Broadband Bits podcast.